Hey everyone, I want to welcome you to the luxurious basement studios of the Silbar complex. We're going to try to do some remote learning by video for the first time and see how it goes. And if we have any success, we're going to continue doing this. So today we're going to focus on US Reconstruction, Part 1. So the way that you have to kind of look at Reconstruction and the war itself was that a number of things went wrong well before the war even broke out. One of the ways that you could look at the Civil War was kind of like a messy divorce. And any therapist will tell you that if you want to get to what happened with the divorce, you have to get to the root cause. And that was one of the big things. Obviously, for anybody who's studied the Civil War at all, you know that the root cause was slavery in some way, shape, or form. Some people will tell you that states' rights was involved. Some people will tell you that it was the slavery issue. Some people will tell you it was the extension of slavery into new territories. But regardless of how you looked at it, it had something to do with slavery. And that issue goes way, way back. I mean, obviously, slavery has been here since the beginning of North America being founded by the English a long, long, long time ago, 1600s. But even in the course of America getting its independence and making its own constitution, you had the gag rule, you had the Three-Fifths Compromise. It was clear that these people did not want to deal with the slavery issue from that point, back in the 1780s. So they couldn't even talk about it until like 1810, 1807. And then when they started to talk about it, some of the northern states, which were more industrial, didn't feel like they needed it anymore. So they got away from it and they canceled it. They saw it as a moral wrong in some ways, but they also didn't need it. In the South, it was agricultural. Slave labor was a big necessity for them. And so they didn't want to get rid of it, obviously. And as time went on, it got worse. And the dispute between the spouses got worse. And the underlying issue was always slavery. And they couldn't get past it. And so they tried to compromise with the Compromise of 1820. They tried to do it with the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the Compromise of 1850. But it was clear that this thing was not going to go away. Right, so how can a divorce affect a family? Much like the Civil War affected all of America. It's going to affect it physically. There's going to be, in some cases, physical violence, and that would be the war itself, where a soldier was killing a soldier. You're going to have economic issues. Obviously, where the family, instead of putting all the money together, united together towards the family, is going to use it against each other. In the case of divorce lawyers, but in our case, we're going to put money towards each side fighting against each other, destroying each other's cities, ripping each other's railroads up, destroying factories, and so on and so on. So as far as putting all this back together again, if we're going to bring the family back together again after a messy divorce, the same thing's going to happen with this country. There's going to be underlying factors. There's going to be bad feelings. There's a lot of baggage that people are going to have to get over. And Lincoln is the president. He's going to try to do his best to put this country back together again. So we're going to look at Chapter 12:1, Presidential Reconstruction. Much of the Confederacy was destroyed from the Civil War. And most of that destruction that you're going to see, obviously, when we talk about the Civil War, was down south. The furthest north that you saw any kind of major battle was Gettysburg in Pennsylvania, but most of it happened down in Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina. If you went out west, it was in places like Mississippi and Louisiana and places like that. Atlanta got burned to the ground. So as far as putting back the country, Reconstruction 1865 to 1877 was the time when the government tried to rebuild the South and return it to the United States. It was controversial and still seen that way today. You can still hear echoes of the Civil War in many of the arguments that we have politically even today. It's taught differently down south than it is in the north. They see it as the war of states' aggression or northern aggression, I should say, and the war of the states' rights. So it's an ongoing thing. The physical toll that it took on us, the Civil War destroyed 2/3 of the southern shipping, 9,000 miles of railroad, farms, farmhouses, and machinery, 1/3 of the livestock, bridges, canals, and levees, thousands of miles on roads, factories, ports, and cities, and farm values dropped about 70%. So when you look at that list and you see everything that's being affected, you're looking at transportation, you're looking at food, you're looking at the economy itself. They have less things that they can sell. They have less things that they can trade. They don't have the ability to make things anymore. They weren't really good at industry to begin with, so they're not even going to have that. But what little they had is now probably gone. Many of the factories have been destroyed. A lot of the cotton that they were growing for, for business and so on has been burned or destroyed or whatever. The human toll on the country included a generation of young, healthy men that were killed. The North lost 364,000, 38,000 of those were African Americans, and the South lost 260,000, which is 1/5 of its white men. And when you think about all of those men that were gone, every single one of those men could have had children, and those people could have had children, and their children could have had children, and so on and so on. So it's not just this number, but it's exponential going forward. Survivors were often scarred for life, physically and mentally. And back then, the mental part was not talked about all that much. Obviously, you saw a lot of people with amputated arms and legs, sometimes numerous. But the mental toll was often overlooked during this time because we didn't really know about PTSD during this time. And so, they were probably just looked at as crazy in a lot of cases and just couldn't fit in. They didn't understand suicide as much back then either. Many civilians died. As we know, in any divorce, children get affected. And in this war, the civilians of our land were like the children. They weren't supposed to be fighting, but many of them still died from the battles that were going on. In some cases, they died from sickness and the poverty and the starvation and so on. And we also left many to be widows and orphans going forward. Now, it's not to say that everybody wasn't affected by the Civil War while it was going on, but there were some groups that were affected more than others. Obviously, if you look at the Black Southerners, they used to be slaves. So now you had 4 million slaves that were suddenly free. 13th Amendment had just been passed, as you may remember from the movie that we watched, Lincoln. It got passed before the war ended, and now these people are free. When the war ends, they can do, well, they're supposed to be able to do whatever they want to. But now being suddenly free, they are homeless. They are jobless. They don't have food. They don't have a way to make money. Some would stay right on the plantations where they had worked, in some cases, their entire lives. Others did move to the city for jobs, but those jobs are not going to be plentiful during this time. The economy is bad, and there's going to be many white people trying to get those jobs also. Now, if you were a plantation owner, life changed dramatically. They lost about $3 billion in slave labor. So they had purchased these people, and now suddenly those people are free. They didn't get reimbursed for them. They weren't going to be able to get that money back, and now they did not have a labor force for these big, huge plantations to be able to grow their crops, the way they used to do it. The federal government also seized $100 million in plantations and cotton, so you may have lost your land on top of it. Confederate money was worthless, so they had to sell property to hire workers or to cover debts. You may remember that paper money, if it doesn't have anything to back it up, like gold or silver during this time, in essence, it was worthless. It is literally just paper, and nobody wants to take it. So if you're trading paper money for a good, you're getting a piece of paper for the good with nothing to back it up. So Confederate money was worthless in a lot of cases, which means even if you had it, you had a lot of it, you still had nothing. Another group that was always on the cusp of poverty were these poor white Southerners. They were always struggling with this because if you lived in the South and you were white, you had a hard time finding work. Most of the work was done by slaves. So why would a plantation owner hire you when he's already bought a slave to do the work? After the Civil War, it got even worse because now you had all these freed blacks that were looking for work, and now you're in competition with them. Many of these people migrated west to Mississippi and Texas. The big question for the North, and especially for Lincoln, was how do we bring the country back together? And whether or not the North should pardon or punish the South for the war. If you have been in a fight with somebody and you need to reconcile with them, but they've done some awful things to you, can you just let it go? Are you willing to let bygones be bygones and just accept them back into the fray again? The Constitution also did not make it clear who had the authority to make any changes. All right? The Constitution can be very vague sometimes. And of all times, we didn't want them to be vague on this thing. But Lincoln was determined to come up with a plan that would be much more forgiving for of the South. And he called it the 10% plan. And so we'll go through the four things together, and then I'll try to explain a little bit about each one. Number one, there was a pardon for, or what we should say, an official forgiveness to any Confederate who took an oath of loyalty to the Union and accept the policy on slavery, meaning that slavery would not exist anymore, the 13th Amendment. Number two, it denied a pardon to any Confederate official or anyone who killed an African American POW. Number three, when 10% of the state's voters took the oath, the state could hold a convention to create a new state constitution. And then number four, states could then hold elections and rejoin the government. So if we look at number one for a second, if you wanted to get a pardon, all you had to do was take the oath, put your hand on the Bible, swear that you're going to be loyal to the Union, and you would say that you accepted that there is no more slavery. Fine. In order for this to happen, if you go down to number three, 10% of the state's voters would have to take this oath in order to move on. So if you look, if we had a classroom full of 30 people, literally all you'd have to do is get 3 of those people to take this oath, and you can move on. You can go to the next step. As far as number two, it denied a pardon to any Confederate official or anyone who killed an African American POW. This may have gone directly to the heart of what the Confederacy did when we started bringing black troops into the war. They actually passed a bill that said that any African American that was caught during battle would go back into slavery. Any African American that was caught in a blue uniform would be put to death immediately. And any Union official, any Union general that was in command would also be put to death if they were in charge of African American POWs. This looks like it may have been a reaction to that. If you go back to number three for a second, it said if you get 10% of the state's voters to take the oath, the state could then hold a convention to create a new state constitution. The reason why it had to be new is because it would have to abide by the idea of no more slavery, the 13th Amendment. It was probably going to also have to go along with the new 14th Amendment that was coming up, which we'll talk about later. If you could get to this point, the 10%, a new state constitution, and so on, your state could then hold elections. You could elect a governor, and more importantly, you could elect representatives and senators to rejoin the government at the Capitol in Washington, D.C. Clearly, Lincoln was not looking to punish anybody. It was kind of in his nature anyway. The primary goal for him always was to reunite the country together, hoping that he could end slavery in the process. Now, as you can imagine, there was a group in the North called the Radical Republicans who were very much opposed to what Lincoln was doing. Radical, obviously meaning going to the extreme. These Republicans were very anti-slavery, and they wanted the South punished for what had happened for the entire war. They also wanted to make readmission of the South to be much more difficult. They wanted a society where African Americans had true equality. They passed their own Reconstruction plan called the Wade-Davis Bill. And in their bill, obviously being much different than Lincoln's, they weren't looking for a 10% oath of loyalty. They were looking for 50%. The idea of getting 50% of any Confederate state to take this oath was ludicrous. It was never going to happen. What they were trying to get out of this, I can't be sure. I mean, ideologically, you can understand where they were coming from, but realistically, it was not going to happen. And if you really had any intention of bringing the country back together again, the 50% was just never going to work. Lincoln obviously opposed this, and instead of coming out and vetoing it officially, he let it die with a pocket veto. And what a pocket veto means is, in essence, he sticks it in his pocket and it just kind of dies. The way a pocket veto officially is supposed to work is that if the Congress is out of session for 10 days and the president holds on to that bill for the entire 10 days and does not sign it and does not veto it, it just dies its own death. He didn't want to look like he was vetoing it, but he also didn't want to accept it because it was not the plan he was looking for, and he knew it wasn't going to work. So he's just going to let it die with a pocket veto, and it looked like things were heading in his direction, but then obviously, April 14th, 1865, everything changed. Any chance that we had of moving forward with this forgiving Reconstruction plan was gone when John Wilkes Booth shot him at Ford's Theater. And this wasn't just an attack on Lincoln. This was an attack, this is actually almost relative to a coup, where they attacked Secretary of State Francis Seward, and they also went after Vice President Andrew Johnson. Lincoln was the only successful assassination. Wilkes Booth obviously got him in the head at on the balcony at Ford's Theater, but Andrew Johnson was supposed to be killed at his hotel, and the guy that was supposed to assassinate him just decided not to. He went out for a drink, and he chickened out or whatever, but he just did not carry through. The people that went after Francis Seward nearly did it. The only thing that saved him was the fact that he was in a neck brace from the carriage accident that he had previously, and the assassin tried to stab him with a knife in the throat. He was sliced up pretty good, and a couple of Seward's sons were nearly killed by the assassin, but they were not successful in carrying it out. So now that was going to leave Reconstruction up to Vice President Andrew Johnson, who's a different kind of character. Lincoln picked him to be his vice president because he was a Southern Democrat. Lincoln, obviously a Republican from Illinois in the North, knew that getting reelected in 1864 in the middle of a civil war was going to be very, very difficult. In order to secure, hopefully, some Democratic votes in the North, because the Confederacy was still out, none of them were voting at this point. He hoped that maybe getting Johnson on the ticket would get him reelected, and it did. So Lincoln chose him as a VP so he could get Democratic votes, and he did get reelected, maybe because of that. Johnson's Reconstruction plan was much closer to Lincoln's. He was more for pardoning Southerners who swore allegiance to the Union. He allowed states to have a convention to make a new state constitution, but you did not need the 10% oath loyalty that even Lincoln was looking for. States were to end secession and abolish slavery, obviously 13th Amendment. And states could then hold elections and rejoin the government, much like Lincoln had said. This plan was even more forgiving than Lincoln's. Johnson wound up pardoning 13,000 Confederates, which may have been partly because he himself was a Confederate. He was from the South. He had no love for secession. He did not want secession to happen, but he was a Southerner, and he was willing to be a little more forgiving than even Lincoln was towards the people that were involved in this. As you'll see later on, that Johnson was not well liked by the radical Republicans at all. They're going to have a major issue with him, and that will lead to an impeachment, which we'll get into later on. As we move on, what is this going to mean for any of the freed blacks? All right, slavery is now ended, which means all these people were supposed to be free. Well, what does that mean? Well, you had freedom of movement, which means that they could just leave the plantation, try to find their families that they had lost due to slavery. Some of them did that, but if you think about it, how were they going to get anywhere? They didn't have any money. They didn't have a way to get anywhere. Would you move north? The Northerners were looking to free you, but the Northerners did not necessarily want you up there with them. Racism ran rampant up in the North also. You could stay in the South. It's the home that you always knew, but the people there are going to look at you the same way that they always did, maybe even worse, because now you have freedoms, and they can't handle that. You could move west. You'd have a much better chance of having freedom out there, and maybe people leaving you alone because there's very few people out there, but the dangers are huge. You're going to run into Native American tribes that don't want you there. You're going to run into weather that you've never seen before. You're going to run into disease. You're going to run into animals that you've never seen before. You're going to run into plagues of locusts and things like that. There's just too many different things to take on all at the same time when you've got this new freedom going on. You had the freedom to own land. There were attempts to divide plantation land up and distribute it to former slaves, but eventually this whole thing failed. The process was called 40 acres and a mule. And the idea was that every single freed slave would get 40 acres of land and a mule, in essence, to kind of get your farm going, to get your life going. It never panned out the way that they wanted it to do. Any African American who has the money, which most didn't, could now actually buy their own land if you could get people to sell to you. You had freedom of worship, and it's hard to believe that this was even a thing, but slaves were not really allowed to worship the way that they wanted to. Many times they had to go out in the woods to pray to God, to sing hymns or whatever. They had to hide it. Now you could actually form your own church, and this is where some of the black churches that exist today got their start from. Freedom to learn, and again, it's hard to believe that this is even a thing, but one of the key aspects of slavery was that it was against the law to teach any African American how to read or write. Education was dangerous. If you could read and you could write, it meant you could communicate. It meant that you could read things, you could read ideas that people put into your head about freedom, about your rights, about the Constitution, and things like that. And there wasn't a slave owner down there that ever wanted that to happen, because that was going to lead to protest, that was going to lead to riots, it was going to lead to huge rebellions, and the slaves outmanned the whites by far. So it's the last thing that they wanted to. So now they had freedom to learn. There were some white teachers from the North, mostly women, and other African Americans that would try to teach anybody who was willing to learn at this point. And it was going to be a long process. There was one group that was setting out to try to help people the best that they could. It didn't last long. It was called the Freedmen's Bureau. And the whole idea was to set up black Southerners to adjust to their freedom. Maybe to try to give them some money if they could, to give them supplies, to give them food if they needed to, and so on. Clothing, medical supplies, education, whatever they could. But again, you need funding for those kinds of things. And you're doing this in a hostile environment in these states that are just getting used to the fact that their slaves are free. Okay, so that's part one of Reconstruction. It was a lot to take in. We'll cover section 2 next as we go further on. And at the end of this, we'll post some questions for your assignment for Friday. And if you have any questions, we can talk about it in class also. So I hope that you got something out of this. And I hope that it's worth watching. And if you have any questions, you have any comments about how I could do this better, please let me know, because this is totally new. I have to pretend that I'm in a classroom with you guys, and it's kind of hard to not take questions like we're used to getting. So check this out. Let me know what you think, and we'll try to do this again in the future. Thanks.